Hello, everyone, and welcome back to this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. Thank you guys so very much for tuning into today's show, and it should be a fantastic Thursday show today. We are going to conclude our divisional fantasy previews, switching from the AFC to the NFC. We're going to close them out. We're also going to talk about a couple of fantasy football storylines that you might want to follow. And stick around to the end of today's show, where I'll be discussing my way too early 2024-25 fantasy hockey player rankings. It's winding down the season. Who knows if the Oilers can close it out and come back from down 3-0. So we'll never know, but we'll do a hockey segment for you guys today. And it should conclude our show in a very nice way. But before we begin with anything else, I always ask that you like, follow, and subscribe to the show on both Podcast Network and Sports Network pages or YouTube. We also do receive a lot of tips and donations, so if you do ever feel so inclined, please leave them at the link gsmc.cloud. It's a huge support to both me, my fellow podcasters, and the network, so anything you leave is greatly appreciated. You can also leave a question, comment, or concern about something I said on a prior segment, and I will address that at the beginning of the next episode. But without further ado, let's get right into today's show. Like I said before, we are going to be concluding our NFC divisional fantasy previews, and today we start off up north in the NFC North, a very young, scrappy, hungry division that had a NFC Championship representative for the first time in many a year in the Detroit Lions, but this division definitely feels very player-centric, especially considering the fantasy implications that stem from it because of the fact you now have two rookie quarterbacks in very exciting markets in both Caleb Williams in Chicago and J.J. McCarthy in Minnesota. You have a team that has been laying in the weeds for many years in the Detroit Lions, who finally has a high-powered offense that will get the city excited again. And then you have one of the most sneaky teams in the entire NFL in the Green Bay Packers, who everyone thought would have a very rough transition from Aaron Rodgers to Jordan Love, but in fact it ended up going very seamlessly, and they themselves could have had a shot at making it to at least the NFC Championship. So as you can see, this definitely is a well-rounded division, and there's a lot of talent to choose from in your fantasy drafts. But without further ado, let's just jump right into a team-by-team breakdown. I was thinking maybe a position-by-position breakdown would be a bit more interesting for this division, but I think it's very appropriate that we dissect each team respectively due to the fact that there are so many storylines to choose from when we look at each of them. So let's start off with perhaps the new exciting team, mainly due to Caleb Williams arriving in the city of Chicago, the Chicago Bears. We'll talk a little bit about Caleb Williams tomorrow and his projections in another segment for that show. But Caleb Williams definitely brings an excitement that wasn't in Chicago before. Obviously, you had Justin Fields before, and there was a lot of hype surrounding him, mainly due to his dual threat ability, but he didn't pan out. Maybe you can say it was due to coaching scheme, we'll never know. But in comes Caleb Williams in his stead, and I think he's going to have a fantastic rookie season, mainly due to the weapons around him. This is the most well-rounded receiver core in this division, in my humble opinion, and with Caleb Williams throwing the ball to them, they could be primed for breakout campaigns. Let's start off with a guy in DJ Moore, who last year was the number one receiver. Maybe he's not this year, as they added Keenan Allen to this group. But DJ Moore had a fantastic year last year. 888 yards, 52.2 yards per game. He had 118 targets, only 63 receptions, but he did have 7 TDs. So as you can see, there's a little bit of instability in his statistics, but with a more established quarterback coming out of the college ranks in Caleb Williams, maybe that production goes up. I think that Caleb Williams is going to rely on DJ Moore a lot in the early goings, as he is an established part of the Chicago Bears for the past couple of years. He knows the system, and I think he's going to help break Caleb Williams in a little bit. So look for DJ Moore at the beginning of the year to potentially be a nice little fantasy option for you guys. But a guy who I really think is going to have an interesting campaign is their tight end, Cole Kmet. I had Cole Kmet last year. Obviously, a couple of disappointing games. He's a very hit or miss player. When he misses in spectacular fashion. But last year, with one of the worst quarterbacks in recent Chicago Bears history in Tyson Bagent, he was kind of playing very well, especially in the red zone. So look for Caleb Williams in a pinch in the red zone to look Cole Kmet's way. I think he's a solid tight end option. He had a career high in catches and receiving yards last year, even with unstable quarterback play. So Cole Kmet is someone who I'm going to keep my eye on. Potential steal in fantasy drafts, especially if you're looking for someone who can get a couple of touchdowns, steal a couple of touchdowns away from high-end receivers. But in terms of that position group, those two guys, in my opinion, are prime for breakout campaigns. Now, obviously, you bring in Rome Odunze as well from the draft from the University of Washington, and you acquire Keenan Allen from the Chargers. So Caleb Williams has a wealth of riches in that skill position group. But those two guys, in my humble opinion, are two guys I see as potential breakout candidates. Not necessarily guys who are going to be steady throughout. They could have very up and down games depending on certain weeks. But remember these two guys' names, because I believe that they will be the Chicago Bears that really helped Caleb Williams have an easy transition to the NFL. That being said, let's transition to the team that surprisingly won the division last year, centered around the philosophy of their coach Dan Campbell and a very hard-nosed game plan every single week. The Detroit Lions. The Detroit Lions are quickly becoming one of the more attractive teams in terms of fantasy options, mainly because every single player in this squad has elevated their game. Let's start off with their quarterback, Jared Goff. He's not necessarily seen as a sexy fantasy quarterback pick, but his stats over the years do not lie. He has 289.1 fantasy points last year. That's solid for a QB. And he's a metronomic presence for the Detroit Lions. Has 9,000 yards through his first 48 games with them, his first two seasons. 75 touchdowns and 27 picks. So as you can see, he's not going to be one of those guys who's going to break out in terms of yardage, get a number of touchdowns, but he's very steady. He's one of the many quarterbacks I had streaming last year in my league, trying to find the right situation, and he was one of the most steady ones. Not mainly because of his big numbers or anything, but just because he can put up touchdowns, he can put up points, and he has a reliable offense that can get him going at any time. He's never down or out or low about his game. He always feels good because he knows his skill position. Talents are going to be there to uplift him. And so let's look at those skill position players. Starting off with a tight end who, while he definitely is going to be considered for the tight end one and was the consensus tight end one last year in fantasy, he's going to definitely have a lot of questions surrounding him because of the fact that it was the least impressive tight end fantasy season for a tight end one in recent years in Sam Laporta. He had 153.3 fantasy points. That's decent for a tight end. But the main question is, can he become even better? He's coming off an injury he sustained in the playoffs. And obviously, as a rookie, that's always difficult to come back from. But Sam Laporta, he was a steady presence in that system. Used in the seam a lot. Used in the slot. He can move around a lot. He's very versatile. So I think he can sustain that tight end one mark. It's just a question of how will his production elevate from last year, especially in a receiving core that includes a guy in Amon-Ra St. Brown, who is absolutely incredible. Fantastic route runner, fantastic catcher of the football. So let's just go over his stats, and they speak for themselves. 1,161 yards last year for 72.6 yards per game on 146 targets and 106 receptions for 6 TDs. So as you can see, whatever Jared Goff needs him to do, Amon-Ra St. Brown can do it, and efficiently. He can run routes. He can get yards after the catch. He's just a strong receiver at the catch point. So look for him to be targeted early and often. So if you're in a PPR league, Amon-Ra St. Brown can be the number one pick for you in terms of that Lions system. But overall, the Lions are the most attractive team. Now let's get to the last two teams. Obviously, the Minnesota Vikings. I certainly think that J.J. McCarthy can start a couple of games, but I believe that Sam Darnold is going to start the season off. But you're going to want to cover your ears, Vikings fans, because his best fantasy season came all the way back in 2019, where he only averaged 14.6 fantasy points per game. However, the Minnesota Vikings have faith in knowing that they still have Justin Jefferson, signed a very lengthy contract extension, made him one of the wealthiest wide receivers in the league. And just a steady presence, although last year, due to injuries he sustained, only 11.6 fantasy points per game. He definitely wants to step that up. He only had 186.2 overall, and we know that he does want to help this young Vikings team and this young Vikings quarterback and J.J. McCarthy. And with the contract finally settled, I think he will have a breakout year. Last but not least, the Green Bay Packers, the surprise team of last year in this division. Let's just go over Jordan Love. I think that he's going to be seen more of as a super flex option in a 2 QB league. I certainly believe he has value as a starter, maybe a couple years down the road. But this wide receiver core is definitely one of the most interesting. This is going to seem like a weird comparison, but they feel like the Boston Celtics of wide receiver cores, mainly due to the fact that they spread the wealth around a lot. And the target share is going to be pretty even here. But I do believe their top receiver in terms of fantasy this year will be Jaden Reed. He's kind of a number 3 fantasy option. He did score 10 touchdowns last year. He had 13.6 PPR points per game, so if you're in a PPR league, he could be a nice little pickup. But a guy I want to watch out for in terms of this Packers receiving core, who might be a little bit stealthy, is Dontavion Wicks. Because last year he averaged 15.7 PPR points in 3 of his last 4 outings. I think that Dontavion Wicks is prime for a breakout year. But overall, the Packers receiving core is going to be one of the most balanced, so maybe shy away from them in 1 QB leagues. But overall, that should just about do it for the NFC North. A lot to pack in, a lot of new faces, sophomore slump seasons kind of progressing. So we'll have to see how this all pans out. But coming up next, we're going to transition to probably one of the worst divisions in terms of fantasy in the NFC South. It has to be talked about because we're doing all the divisions. We will be right back with that. You may want to tune out for this one if you're not a Bucks, Panthers, Saints, or Falcons fan. But it has to be done. So we'll be right back with that segment.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign.
I wanna be the greatest. Everybody on the fake shit. I look around and feel like everybody is the fakest. I make this every day and I'm impatient, hoping one day I blow up from the basement. Statement, the top is so vacant. I don't hear shit that I think is amazing. Waiting for my day when I'm playing sold out shows for 1,000 faces. Hey, give me that crown, get in my way and to be put down. It ain't your place, all this my town. If I want that shit, then I'll get it right now. I'm losing it, the noose it fits. I'm losing shit, a stupid myth. You choose to live or choose to dip. You choose to fight or lose your grip and lose a gift.
I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody in the world blind? Please, Lord, give me a sign, a sign. I feel like I'm losing my mind. Is everybody...
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you enjoyed today's first segment where I dissected the NFC North in terms of fantasy implications. Definitely a very intriguing division to look out for. But we go from intriguing to kind of barren. I'm sorry guys. It has to be done, like I said before the break. We are going to be previewing the NFC South. Definitely not the best of divisions, but maybe that works out in their favor a little bit because it's so even and anyone can be expected to win except the Panthers. I'm sorry, Carolina Panthers fans, but it's just not going to happen for many years. I still think that because it's so even, there are a couple of players who might rise to the occasion and become one of the breakout stars of the upcoming fantasy football season. So without further ado, let's go right into this segment. Now, in terms of the NFC South, there are definitely going to be a lot of surprises. As the weeks go on in the upcoming NFL season, this division could be very volatile from second to second. One team could rise to the occasion, another team might fail to meet expectations, or it could be vice versa. There are definitely a lot of storylines to follow, especially in this division where there's so many different ways a team can win, and it's just getting to 9 wins, I feel like, in the NFC South in order to win this division. Maybe even 8 will do it for you to win the NFC South. But that does not mean I still don't think certain players can emerge and rise to the occasion in terms of fantasy for you guys. Without further ado, let's get into it. Let's talk about the surprise team of last year in the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. Obviously, everyone thought it was going to be a transition year. They had that Super Bowl run with Tom Brady. Brady retired, not coming back. Sorry, Tom Brady fans. But then they bring in Baker Mayfield. Everyone's like, oh, woe is me. What are the Bucs going to be this year? And Baker actually had a shockingly fantastic season. He definitely had some up and down moments, but for the most part, he was a steady presence in that Bucs offense. He finished as QB 17 last year. He averaged 17.4 fantasy points per game, not too shabby. Obviously, those numbers are a little bit deflated and reflective of his poorer games, but still, that's a very good average for someone who has had a very shaky career, being a part of many different teams, a journeyman quarterback, a former number 1 pick as well. But I still think Baker Mayfield is appealing, mainly the streamer option in 1 QB leagues. You could draft him in a super flex league as a QB2, but I think he's going to be a fun person to watch in his progress throughout the season, especially with his skilled receiver core, and choose to pick him come what may as he progresses throughout the season and has his up and down moments. But his receiving cores were probably the most steady in the entire division, with Mike Evans and Chris Godwin, 2 of the best to do it in the NFC. Mike Evans, what more can we say about him? When all is said and done, first ballot Hall of Famer. 10 straight 1,000-yard seasons. Last year, 136 targets. Always an appealing PPR option. Along with his teammate. His teammate definitely doesn't get as much attention, but Chris Godwin did have 130 targets as well, but only 104 receptions. So I think that the trouble with picking a Bucs receiver is that Baker may want to include Godwin a bit more. Last year I had Godwin on my own fantasy team, and he definitely was disappointing. He didn't get as much attention as Mike Evans. Mike Evans certainly is Baker's go-to guy, but I think this year maybe Mike Evans decreases a little bit in terms of target share, and Godwin definitely can step up. But overall, the Bucs are probably the most appealing fantasy options in terms of teams in this division. Let's kind of go from hero to zero a little bit. We have to talk about the Carolina Panthers. Obviously, if you were to say they're the worst team in football, I wouldn't find any fault with that statement. There's definitely not much excitement around them. However, they can't get much worse than last season. Obviously, there have been only 2 0-16 teams. I don't think it's going to happen for them. They had a lot of coaching changes, and they brought in Dave Canales, who seems to be a QB whisperer. Definitely can help Bryce Young, who we're going to talk about a little bit. Bryce Young, as bad as he was, here's an interesting statistic. He threw more interceptions in his last year at the University of Alabama than he did last year. So that's a silver lining to a very rough rookie season for Bryce Young. I think he could be an appealing super flex option. It all depends on how his receivers help him and how the Panthers organization helped him in the offseason. They added a lot of talent around him. They drafted Jonathan Brooks. If he's healthy, he can be an appealing option at the running back position. They still have Adam Thielen, no matter how old he's getting. They have Jonathan Mingo. And they drafted Xavier Legette, who I really, really like later in the second round. He's a big body receiver out of South Carolina, one of the most underrated wide receivers in the SEC last year. And so I think that Bryce Young certainly has the system around him. It's a question of who can step up. I think the position you look at if you're wanting to pick a Panther, that's a weird statement to say, but it has to be said. I'm looking at the running back position because it's going to be a competition between Chuba Hubbard and Miles Sanders. Here's an interesting statistic to know. Hubbard started 7 more games. He had more targets, he had more carries, more touches, and more yards. 470 to be exact. So Chuba Hubbard could be a nice little RB3 situation in terms of your fantasy drafts. I think he could be a potential steal. But that's all that can be said about the Carolina Panthers. I wouldn't necessarily say fade anyone because we'll definitely have to see how Bryce Young progresses in his second year. Who knows? Maybe he has a breakout sophomore year, and second-year QBs are definitely more highly coveted in terms of fantasy drafts than others. So we'll certainly have to see with him. But let's move on to another one of the most exciting offenses in this NFC South, mainly due to the changes in terms of their offensive scheme and play calling and changes at the quarterback position as well in the Atlanta Falcons. Obviously, Kirk Cousins comes into the Atlanta Falcons, probably the best quarterback they've had over the past 3 years or so. He's not necessarily the sexiest fantasy quarterback. He's not going to be a 20-plus points guy. He, for the Minnesota Vikings, is just a steady presence. He's a 14, 15, 16 point per game fantasy quarterback. He relied more on his receivers than his receivers relied on him to get them the ball. That's what can be said about Kirk Cousins. But in an Atlanta Falcons system that expects a lot from him, I definitely think he can elevate his game, mainly because of the fact that these young receivers want to be the best they can possibly be. Let's start off with Drake London. Yet to have 1,000-yard season. That could definitely change if Kirk Cousins looks his way often. Look for Drake London to kind of extend his route tree a little bit. Obviously, he was seen as the vertical threat in this offense, the guy that's going to run a lot of go and post routes. But look for him to change up the way he runs routes, getting more into the short to intermediate areas of the field for Kirk Cousins to look for him. And so that's the way I see Drake London getting those yardage numbers up and getting that fantasy production up as well. He had 117 and 109 targets last year, so that's nothing to worry about there. He's fantastic in terms of PPR. The question is, can those come from different routes that the Falcons run for him? And then let's go to Bijan Robinson. Bijan, obviously we talked a lot about him on this show. His touches should go up. Raheem Morris wants his touches to go up. It's just a question of where and when they will come from. I think he can be a fantastic red zone threat. I'm a huge University of Texas fan, and seeing his progression at UT, I think that Bijan Robinson definitely has the hunger and ability to progress himself. He definitely wants to grow into this offense, and if Raheem Morris keeps his word, we're going to see a lot more Bijan Robinson in this, and he's going to live up to his fantasy projections as well. But that should just about do it for the Falcons. Let's go to the last team here, and the Saints. The Saints are another one of those teams that could make a couple of noises in the early goings of the season, but I expect them to fall apart mid-season. They're always going to be one of those 7 to 8 win teams that always lingers. Maybe people are hopeful about them to get into the playoffs, but it never happens for them. Let's just talk about Derek Carr for a second. I always try to defend Derek Carr because, in my humble opinion, he certainly has had one of the best deep balls in all of football. He certainly can throw the ball on the field, sling the rock around the yard, but it doesn't translate to fantasy or real life. He was the QB 28 last year with 13.9 fantasy points per game, so Derek Carr is steadily declining. The only player of note on the New Orleans Saints right here is Chris Olave. He had 138 targets last year, 23.8% target share. So obviously, Derek Carr relies a lot on him. I think Rashid Shaheed could be someone you look out for later in mid-round picks. The Chris Olave is perhaps the only person I would really roster confidently from the New Orleans Saints. But overall, that should just about do it for the NFC South section. Make of this what you will. Draft someone from the Carolina Panthers or New Orleans Saints at your own peril. But coming up next is one of my favorite divisions because it has that team right there in it. The NFC West, the best of the NFC West. Obviously a little bit more top-heavy than it has been in recent years. But we are going to dissect a lot of interesting storylines as well from the NFC West. We will be right back with that final divisional breakdown on the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast.
Looking for your daily fix of sports talk without having to pay for it? GSMC Sports Network is available on YouTube. Just search GSMC Sports Network. Get your fix of daily sports talk shows on YouTube, absolutely free. NFL, college football, NBA, MLB, MMA, UFC, fantasy football, and so much more. GSMC Sports Network has shows running all day long, with new sports shows starting every 2 hours. Just like on your favorite cable sports channel, except GSMC Sports Network is absolutely free. Just search GSMC.
Hello everyone and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. We are going to conclude our NFC divisional breakdowns and divisional breakdowns overall with one of my favorite divisions, the NFC West. A lot of top heaviness in this division, obviously, with the San Francisco 49ers staking their claim as one of the best teams not only in the division but in the entire NFL, much like the Kansas City Chiefs do in the AFC West. But there are still a lot of intriguing players and players I really love, especially on that team right there. Go Hawks all the way. I'm still sticking with them. I'm not jumping the ship. So let's just dissect this division, shall we? It should be an interesting one as our last division breakdown of the day. Here, just pull up. Yes. So the NFC West should be one of the most intriguing divisions this year. A lot of different storylines, especially surrounding the top dog on the San Francisco 49ers. So we'll start with them. Let's talk about the controversy surrounding Brock Purdy. A lot of people still call him a systems quarterback, myself included, mainly because I kind of have to hate him a little bit. But still, Brock Purdy, let's look at his fantasy stats, because his real-life stats show that, yes, he sometimes has his issues and he sometimes shines. But in terms of fantasy, he's the QB 8 last year, and his 5.5 air yards ranked first among QBs who started 7 or more games. So, in real time, Brock Purdy is dispelling the notion that he's a systems quarterback who mainly just operates the offense that Kyle Shanahan employs. And he's really proving everyone wrong in fantasy as well, because the stats don't lie. He sits comfortably in the top 10 at the position. And so, Brock Purdy, while he might not be the most appealing name out there, I certainly would start him at quarterback if you're considering that, because of the fact, A, he has the weapons, B, he has the talent to elevate those weapons, and C, Kyle Shanahan trusts him to drive the car of this offense. And so Brock Purdy, I really, really think can stay in that top 10 in terms of fantasy QBs. I don't think he's going to decline at all. Now, a person who could decline, and it's funny to say, is Christian McCaffrey. There's only one way to go from being and finishing with 2 overall RB1 finishes with 390 plus points, and that's down. Obviously, though, he's not competing with that many running backs. You know, Elijah Mitchell might get a couple of touches, but Christian McCaffrey is someone who's going to get a lot of touches. However, it does seem a bit weird that as the years go on, his fantasy production in terms of touchdowns seems to be regressing. I feel like Christian McCaffrey, he's someone who you can rely on a lot, and he's probably going to be the number 1 overall pick in many drafts. But it just feels like maybe the San Francisco 49ers are going to want to focus on maintaining a pass-first kind of philosophy. He's always a reliable outlet, but if there's one stat that's kind of unusual in his season from last year, his 21 rushing touchdowns last year, whereas 32% of his total fantasy points. And you're probably thinking, well, He's just so versatile, he'll definitely continue his fantasy production. Maybe his biggest weakness is his versatility, because he doesn't necessarily focus in one field, and he can do it all, and maybe that's going to decline as Brock Purdy looks to include more of his receivers. And so I'm going to be wary of Christian McCaffrey. But let's transition to the San Francisco 49ers receivers. A lot of trade rumor mills arose, especially during draft time, between Deebo Samuel and Brandon Ayuk. I think that now that they're kind of settling down, saying that they're not leaving, I think that they'll be just fine. However, I now see Brandon Ayuk as the top receiver for the San Francisco 49ers in real life and in fantasy over Deebo, mainly just due to his route running ability. I think that he definitely improved on this season. One of the main reasons, especially in the playoffs, where he kind of broke out, that I am saying this, Brandon Ayuk can be a top 10 fantasy wide receiver by year's end. So look out for Brandon Ayuk on draft boards. But overall, the San Francisco 49ers, just a wealth of talent to choose from if you should in your fantasy draft. But let's move on to the Los Angeles Rams. Kind of another surprise team in the NFC last year. Obviously, they didn't have Cooper Kupp for large portions of the season, but no matter, they have a new sheriff in town in Puka Nacua, who had a breakout rookie season. A 5th-round draft pick out of BYU, just putting the league on notice. Not for any kind of special trait, but just being like one of those reliable receivers. Those guys, maybe when you're playing football in recess, who always were open no matter what they looked like, how they played the game. That's Puka Nacua, in my humble opinion. He just gets open no matter what. And Matthew Stafford really benefited from that. Let's talk about Matthew Stafford. He was a top 12 QB in last year, in the last 6 years as well. So Matthew Stafford is always going to be reliable. The question is, can Puka Nacua replicate his season this season? He had over 1,400 yards and 6 touchdowns and 105 receptions. So he's a PPR monster as well as just a fantasy monster in general. So look for that duo to elevate. Obviously, should Cooper Kupp look healthy in training camp, he's definitely going to have to compete again with Puka to retain that number 1 wide receiver position. But Puka Nacua is definitely going to be off fantasy boards earlier than he was last year. Definitely not going to be streamed by many this year. He's going to be one of the starting receivers on your team, in my humble opinion. And overall, the Rams definitely have a lot of upside. They have Kyron Williams at the running back position, who had a breakout year. So I think the Los Angeles Rams are definitely going to be a very intriguing team to follow in terms of fantasy. But let's look at my favorite team in this division, the Seattle Seahawks. Don't sleep on them this year, especially offensively. Now let's talk about Geno. Obviously, he had a fantastic 2022 campaign, especially in fantasy. He had 18.7 fantasy points per game in 2022, still under Pete Carroll. But then he regressed to the mean a little bit last year with 15.4 fantasy points per game. However, he has said that with the hiring of Ryan Grubb from the University of Washington, who was in control of one of the best offenses in college football last year, he's starting to say that he's seeing things he's never seen before. A lot of verbiage, a lot of different route concepts introduced into this offense. So look for Geno Smith, who's definitely one of the smartest quarterbacks in the league in terms of his footballing IQ, to handle that offense with ease. I'm really intrigued to see how Geno comes out this year, manning that QB position. Obviously, they did bring in Sam Howell to compete with him, but Geno Smith is still the number 1 QB in my eyes. Let's talk about his receivers, because the receivers are kind of iffy, in my humble opinion, when it comes to fantasy. Let's talk about DK Metcalf first, because I think he is now the new number 1 wide receiver, supplanting Tyler Lockett. Here's a weird stat about DK Metcalf. He has had no season over 15 fantasy points per game, but he has had no season with less than 13.3 or ranked less than wide receiver 26. So DK Metcalf, he's kind of at that median baseline for fantasy wide receivers. I think you can take him at your own risk. Maybe you bench him for a couple of weeks and then put him in for a game that looks appealing for him. But DK Metcalf certainly is someone who is definitely hit or miss. I don't like to say it because he's one of my favorite receivers in the league, and one of my favorite teams in the league, but DK Metcalf is certainly one to watch. And then Tyler Lockett, he has had the most targets of his career last year, but less than 1,000 yards. So, make of that what you will. Tyler Lockett, I think you're going to have to fade. Maybe DK Metcalf is a Seattle Seahawks wide receiver you buy into, but overall, I'm really interested to see how this offense comes out this year. And last but not least, let's talk about the Arizona Cardinals. A much more surprising year under Jonathan Gannon without Kyler Murray than people expected. But with Kyler Murray, obviously he's always going to have high upside as a rushing quarterback. He averaged 5.5 rush attempts in the games he played last year. So I really think that Kyler Murray, definitely we're going to have to see how he comes back from injury in a full season. But overall, I think that Kyler Murray still has a little bit of upside. But the player I'm most intrigued about from the Arizona Cardinals is Trey McBride. Because from week 8 onward, he averaged 8.4 targets per game, 6.6 receptions, 65.5 yards, and had 3 touchdowns. He is a tight end to look out for in this league, and one of the more intriguing players in the NFC West should you want a steal in your fantasy draft. But that should just about do it for my NFC divisional breakdowns, and that should just about conclude all my divisional breakdowns. Coming up next, we are going to follow up on a couple of the storylines that have been brought up as I've been doing these fantasy football segments, so you don't want to miss that segment. We will be right back. Thank you guys yet again for listening into these divisional breakdowns.
For the best and latest podcasts available anywhere, go to the podcast app on your cell phone and type in GSMC to access free content-rich podcasts on health and wellness, book reviews, sports, entertainment, relationships, social media, movies, technology, finance, and even weird news. Subscribe and download the GSMC Podcast Network's family of shows. Available.
Hello, everyone, and welcome back to the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast. I hope you like that kind of rapid-fire NFC divisional breakdown that I did, concluding today with that. But I'm going to switch to the top fantasy football storylines that have arisen. There are a lot to cover here, whether it be about certain offenses, about certain players, about certain position groups that might be, aging out a little bit. I think this segment is definitely going to be one you guys want to tune into should you have concerns about fantasy questions that are arising within your head as you look ahead to fantasy drafts. This is the segment for you. So without further ado, let's jump right into it. So, in terms of storylines for the season, I think that one we have to talk about is definitely certain offenses. Offenses are definitely kind of rising to the occasion now that certain players are going to different places. And we have to talk about one offense in particular, an offense that we mentioned earlier on in today's show. Let's talk about the Atlanta Falcons offense. It seems like they're always going to be talked about now that Kirk Cousins is there because of the putrid quarterback play that they've had in the past, surrounding these talented players who just haven't had their potential tapped into yet, mainly because of the fact that A, their coaches failed them, and B, the quarterbacks have failed them. So we have to talk about the Falcons offense. Now, they bring in Raheem Morris as their new head coach, definitely more defensive minded, but he has put Falcons fans' minds at ease talking about the offense and talking about certain players within it. But also, Zach Robinson comes in as the offensive coordinator out of the Sean McVay coaching tree, no less. And so I certainly feel that there's going to be a lot more concepts implemented into that offense where you get more passing first philosophies. And because it's Kirk Cousins, you definitely believe that he will get the job done there as well. Now, for the skill position players, obviously I've talked a lot about them. Drake London, he's outside the top 20 in terms of targets, receptions, yards, and TDs during each of his first 2 seasons, so he definitely wants to look to progress. Bijan Robinson didn't even get many carries inside the red zone. I think that Bijan Robinson is one of the biggest red zone threats as a running back in the league. Only 2 carries inside the 5-yard line. It just speaks to how Arthur Smith kind of neglected him in those positions. And then, of course, Kyle Pitts, who has really been disappointing, one of the most coveted prospects a couple of years ago, but only 6 career touchdowns in one top 12 fantasy season. So as you can see, there's a lot of hope surrounding this Falcons offense, that because of the fact they have so many new faces, especially in their coaching personnel, and then at the quarterback position with Kirk Cousins, I certainly feel like a lot of Falcon fans really hope they got this right, because they don't want another season of disgusting, filthy quarterback play to plague them. They want to make a playoff run. And it looks like with the moves they made in the front office and in their offensive scheme, they are looking primed to do just that. Let's switch from an offense to an offensive player we've also talked about during many episodes, Aaron Rodgers. Aaron Rodgers, when he plays on his day, he's definitely one of the top 5 fantasy players. Even though the last time he played, he did not crack the top 12 quarterback rankings, and a lot of people are down on him heading into the season. He has averaged back-to-back seasons before the last time he played, where he only averaged 14.1 fantasy points, more than 20 fantasy points, and he rushed for a total of 250 yards, and of course he's a very elite passer. He can score 20 plus in any given week. I think that Aaron Rodgers, especially with the skill position groups from Garrett Wilson and Breece Hall, they're also going to be a very important factor as to how the Jets offense goes, because Garrett Wilson, even with torrid QB play, he has had 1,000 yards in back-to-back seasons, and I think he's going to score a lot of touchdowns. And Hall as well had a lot of injuries in the past, but I think that last year he really showed that he's going to be a breakout star in this league. So overall, Aaron Rodgers returning definitely adds a lot of upside to this very, very exciting Jets offense. And so I definitely feel that now teams and defenses are going to have to respect Aaron Rodgers as a passer a lot more, because Garrett Wilson was scary beforehand, and that was with Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, and Trevor Siemian throwing the ball. Aaron Rodgers, A, is more mobile than them and is more willing to run, maybe not as much as he's 40 years old, but B, he has the arm strength that those guys did not, and he can trust a receiver and develop a rapport with them. And once Aaron Rodgers develops rapport with receivers, they definitely elevate their game to the way he is playing. So Aaron Rodgers returning to this Jets offense is a scary proposition for defenses, because you don't necessarily know what to expect anymore, whereas when it was Zach Wilson, Tim Boyle, and Trevor Siemian playing, you definitely knew that they were very limited in what they can run in terms of their passing game. But let's talk now about the group of quarterbacks as a whole, because quarterbacks are a highly volatile position. They can win you games, they can lose you games, they can also keep you in games, and it's always important to choose the right one, because if you mess up, you're going to find yourself streaming quarterbacks up the wazoo. You're going to be looking at waiver wires early on, but you want someone you can really settle with for a large portion of your fantasy football season. And so, one particular area of quarterbacks we should look into are second-year quarterbacks. And this year's crop is definitely very intriguing. We've seen it a lot in the past. After Patrick Mahomes broke out in 2017 in his rookie year, a lot of people chose him in 2018. Lamar Jackson and Josh Allen in 2019, Kyler Murray in 2020, and so on and so forth with guys like Herbert, Burrow, and Lawrence and Fields. However, none of those quarterbacks have finished better than 8th in fantasy points as a rookie. That's not the case with this group of players. I think that this group of players, and C.J. Stroud, Anthony Richardson, and Bryce Young, definitely offer a lot of upside, especially C.J. Stroud, because he's in a system that he knows and loves. After one season, D'Amico Ryans really trusts him to carry the load at the QB position. And he added a lot of different position depth with Stephon Diggs and Joe Mixon, so a lot is not going to be on his plate this year. Also, Bryce Young, we talked about him a little bit before in the NFC South segment. He's definitely someone you can't necessarily sleep on because of the fact that the Panthers are really trying hard to get him that level of depth in the skill position groups to really help his transition from college level to NFL level. He has Xavier Legette, like we said again. He now has Jonathan Brooks as his running back. Especially if he's healthy, he's going to be someone who I think will have a breakout rookie campaign. And also, he still has Adam Thielen and Jonathan Mingo, and they also added Deontay Johnson. So, while Bryce Young is certainly not the most appealing second-year running back to come out of this group, I think that he definitely will not be worse than he is last year. He's definitely going to only get better from here. I think Dave Canales is going to work with him very well. He's kind of known as a QB whisperer, getting a lot out of players like Baker Mayfield in the past. So I really do believe that Bryce Young definitely cannot be slept on. And then Anthony Richardson, he's not necessarily a known commodity. We've only seen 2 complete games with him, but like I said in the last episode, those 2 complete games over a full season would have ranked first among all QBs, so make of that what you will. I think Anthony Richardson's going to have a fantastic fantasy campaign. And then the wild card in terms of second-year quarterbacks is Will Levis. He does have the weapons in Calvin Ridley and DeAndre Hopkins. That's a spectacular wide receiver duo for a second-year quarterback. And he also has a young running back in Tyjae Spears, who is also learning along with him in that backfield. So Will Levis definitely has the support there. But in terms of second-year quarterback, Stroud is the standard, and I would say Richardson is the flyer, in my opinion. And Bryce Young is kind of the sleeper pick. But last but not least, let's talk about another position group and another group of players who are really intriguing. How about the rookie receivers? We always talk about this rookie QB class as being one of the best in recent history, but the rookie receiver class is damn good as well, and they have been for many years right now. With Marvin Harrison Jr., Malik Neighbors, Keon Coleman, and even guys in the latter half of the second round, like Ladd McConkey, I really think that there's a lot of upside to this rookie receiver group. There's so much potential for breakout stars because most of these rookie receivers are in teams that definitely need help at the receiver position. If you look at Marvin Harrison Jr., he immediately becomes the number 1 wide receiver for the Arizona Cardinals. And a guy like Malik Neighbors, Daniel Jones has had a guy like Malik Neighbors in all the years he's been in the league. And so those 2 players right there, certainly people to watch out for. And then a guy in Keon Coleman, who steps into a Buffalo Bills receiver room that lost Stephon Diggs and is looking for a number 2 receiver. He can immediately become that. And a guy in Ladd McConkey, the less we say about the Los Angeles Chargers receiver room, the better. He immediately steps into that room and becomes one of the top 2 receivers at the very least. And then, that's not to say that Xavier Worthy, Brian Thomas Jr., Roman Dunze, even Roman Wilson, and then Xavier Legette, who I've talked about a little bit, cannot step up. There's a system there for all these rookie receivers to elevate their game, really help if they need help at the receiver position in certain teams, or be able to sustain the level of excellence in certain skill position groups if they already have that foundation set. So look out for rookie receivers, especially in this year's fantasy drafts. But that will just about do it for this segment. Coming up for our last segment of the day, we are switching again to hockey mindset as the Stanley Cup Finals wind down. Maybe, who knows, the Oilers could come back and I'll look stupid. We're going to be going over our way too early fantasy hockey player rankings. Should be interesting. I'm just going to go over some of these players on this list who I find to be very intriguing. So you don't want to miss that segment. Should be a fantastic one to close out today's show. Hello everyone and welcome back to the last segment of today's edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. We conclude today's show after a lot of fantasy football talk, breaking down division by division and then the top storylines. We're concluding today's show with a hockey segment, my way too early 2024-25 fantasy player hockey rankings. It should be a fantastic segment because I just took some of the names in this list who I thought were really intriguing and fantastic players from this season and kind of want to share them with you guys as well because I think there's a lot of interesting depth in this list. This is the top 300 players as set out by ESPN for next season. So without further ado, let's get right into it. The number one overall player may shock a little bit of people, but he's no shock to me. I think that he's earned this title. He's definitely competing with a lot of different players for the number one overall fantasy spot. But it's Nathan MacKinnon on an Avs team that certainly is still in their championship window. It's not closing, and he's a top-line center. He's earned that title. He had 626.5 fantasy points this season. Second in points, third in assists, fourth in goals. That's a well-rounded player who I believe deserves to be the top spot. Obviously, you can argue about so many different players getting the top spot, including the guy I'm about to mention right now, also a Stanley Cup finalist at the moment. But Nathan MacKinnon, at the end of the day, is still a spectacular pick to be your number one overall fantasy hockey player for next season, especially on an Avs team that has so much depth. If you look at it, the Avs, honestly, Nathan MacKinnon being the number one overall player could be surprising because they have so much center depth with guys like Mikko Rantanen, Gabriel Landeskog, Cale Makar as a defenseman. Just so well-rounded, and then Nathan MacKinnon just is the glue that brings it all together. So Nathan MacKinnon, I'm not mad at that. I think that Nathan MacKinnon certainly is the number one fantasy player heading into next season. But coming in at number 3, our first Stanley Cup finalist on this list, and it's no surprise as well. He could be number 1. Definitely in the debate any given day. Connor McDavid. But as you can see, he definitely scored a lot fewer points in fantasy than Nathan MacKinnon this year. So maybe it really isn't a debate. He only had 505.4 fantasy points this season. He was 34th in goals, with a big thing that a lot of fantasy hockey supporters would love about Connor McDavid is this is the year he finally found the balance in terms of distribution of the puck. He was first in assists. He was third in points as well. So as you can see, as Connor McDavid elevates his game, yes, maybe his goal production goes down as well as his fantasy production. But it just goes to show that Connor McDavid is ever adaptable, one of the most skilled players in the history of the NHL. And on any given day, he can become the number one player. He's certainly looking up the barrel at Nathan MacKinnon. But Connor McDavid right now certainly is elevating his game to new heights. We are seeing it before our eyes in the Stanley Cup Finals as well. To find the second Stanley Cup finalist and the first from the Florida Panthers, you have to go a little ways down the list to number 14, and Sam Reinhart, one of my favorite fantasy players. You guys have heard all about him on this podcast as the Panthers have made it to the Stanley Cup Finals. One of my guys, he's a do-everything player. Tough in the face-off, tough in the forecheck, fantastic distributor of the puck, scores goals, especially on the power play as well, a huge part of that Florida Panthers power play unit. And he's just an everyman for that Florida Panthers team that strikes you as a team-first unit, a collective group of players tasked with the identity of wanting to win the cup. Sam Reinhart this year, 445.8 fantasy points, second in goals, only 86th in assists and 12th in points. So obviously, this year he was primed to be more of a goal scorer for this Florida Panthers team. They expected him to score a lot more goals than they expected. As you can see in terms of assists, not as many, definitely lower on the list than some players. But 12th in points just goes to show how well-rounded Sam Reinhart can be, even when his stats are inflated in one specific area for him. Overall, I think that it's kind of surprising that he's a top Florida Panther because they have a lot of excellent players that you might be wondering about, like Alexander Barkov. Where's Matthew Tkachuk? You can ask those questions, but Sam Reinhart, I think, in terms of fantasy, if you look up Florida Panthers fantasy player in the dictionary, a picture of Sam Reinhart should appear. So, I'm glad to see him this high on that list. The first goalie on this list is a guy who is getting a lot of respect, has won a lot of Vezina trophies, mainly on a team that hasn't really been as competitive in the Western Conference as people would want, in Connor Hellebuyck. Connor Hellebuyck is a fantastic fantasy hockey goalie for the Winnipeg Jets, a team who has failed to kind of compete in this crowded Western Conference. He has 310.2 fantasy points, 4th in save percentage, 59th only in goals against average, but 2nd in wins. Connor Hellebuyck is such a steady presence in between the creases for the Winnipeg Jets. They're a team that I think is rapidly in decline. They had their heyday a couple of years ago. They haven't really broken out in the slightest. But Connor Hellebuyck has always been a constant in net for them. And it's no surprise that he's a number 1 net minder in ESPN's way too early rankings. In terms of defensemen, you have 2 guys on separate ends of the spectrum here. In terms of a young defenseman who has been a breakout fantasy star over the past couple of years, and a defenseman who's been doing it for many years and is still doing it at a very high level, both in real life and in terms of fantasy. At the number 18 position is Rasmus Dahlin. At the number 10 position is Roman Josi, a man who has done it for many years, like I said. 431 fantasy points. Obviously, not a high goal scorer, only 98th in goals, 12th in assists, but 22nd overall in points. Not too shabby for a defenseman, especially an aging one. And Rasmus Dahlin, one of my favorite fantasy defensemen over the recent couple of years, 339.5 fantasy points overall, also very low in goals. But also very low in assists this season. But overall, both of these guys proving that no matter your age, defensemen can be very vital in terms of winning you fantasy hockey games. So, I'm appreciative of who Rasmus Dahlin and Roman Josi represent, especially being that high up on the list at a less coveted position in fantasy hockey than a lot of people like. One of the only rookies to be in the top 60, and especially in the top 100, is Connor Bedard. He's my rookie of the year, in my humble opinion, out of the Chicago Blackhawks. Obviously, problem with his jaw all year, did not have a full season, so we were kind of robbed of the potential he brings to the NHL, especially to a Blackhawks team that was looking for a generational talent. Only 227.2 fantasy points, kind of the lowest points total in terms of fantasy points in that kind of range from 50 to 60. 106th in terms of goals, 71st in terms of points, but 84th in terms of points. But like I said, we were kind of robbed of what Connor Bedard could be. This was kind of an amuse-bouche season. We are waiting for the main course from Connor Bedard. I think that as the Blackhawks continue to compile draft picks, continue to get better, Connor Bedard is going to become the face and brand of that team. They are going to utilize him in so many different ways. And I'm excited for the future of a guy like Connor Bedard as he becomes one of the stars of the league. An older star of the league, still doing it at the ripe old age of 38. Coming in at number 92, Alex Ovechkin. When is this guy going to retire? We may never know. He's an ageless wonder. 302.5 fantasy points. 36th in goals. That's impressive for someone of his age. Still doing it at the tender age. But let's look at our 2 Stanley Cup goalies. This is the most interesting kind of variant that I saw from this list when I was looking at it. At 55th overall was Stuart Skinner, someone who is very controversial as a goaltender for the Edmonton Oilers. 246.4 fantasy points, kind of low for a goalie. He was 31st in save percentage, 49th in goals against average, but I think what saved him is that in the regular season, he was 3rd in wins, so a lot of people like wins in goalies, especially in categories leagues when goalie wins are one of the most important statistics to know about to win games. And then the surprise, in my opinion, mainly due to the fact that his postseason has definitely been better than his regular season, Sergei Bobrovsky. He had way more points than Stuart Skinner, though. It's 279.6. He was 9th in save percentage as well. Only 69th in goals against average. He was tied for 3rd in terms of wins. So it's kind of weird to see that high-level variant where A lot of people valued Stuart Skinner's wins over Sergei Bobrovsky's more, varied season. So that's kind of interesting. And then a player who, unfortunately, we were kind of robbed of seeing his best in the postseason due to injury, but a player who I really love is definitely going to rise up these player rankings when all is said and done at the end of next season. Roope Hintz. I love Roope Hintz. He just makes the Dallas Stars a better team. Who knows if he were healthy, if the Edmonton Oilers would be the team from the Western Conference to represent in the Stanley Cup Finals. Roope Hintz had 307 fantasy points this year, 42nd in terms of goals, 102nd in terms of assists, tied for 72nd in terms of points. I just feel like Roope Hintz, he is the glue guy for the Dallas Stars. You can see it in the way the Dallas Stars play around. To me, he's a centrifugal force for the Dallas Stars, and I really hope that next season he is going to have another fantastic fantasy year. But that should just about do it for today's show. I hope you guys liked it. Throwing a little bit of hockey in there to conclude today's show. Tomorrow is going to be an even bigger and better show. More varied. I promise it won't be as football heavy. A lot more segments from a lot more different sports. But that should conclude this edition of the GSMC Fantasy Sports Podcast, brought to you as always by the GSMC Sports Network. My name is Christopher Shepard. If you like today's show, like, follow, and subscribe to the GSMC networks on YouTube. Leave a tip or donation at the link gsmc.cloud. If you do feel so inclined, any questions, comments, or concerns can be placed there as well. Thank you guys so much for tuning in. We will be back tomorrow with an even better show.